Great. Okay, take it away.
Okay, so I'm assuming you can hear me and see my slides. Is that correct? Thumbs up from somebody?
Yeah, totally correct.
Yes, nice thumbs up. I like the emoji thing. Yeah, thank you very much, Dave, for the introduction. I am just gonna get started off because I've got a fair amount of ground to cover. And I wanted to say that I'm treating this as a typical Sea Dogs talk, which means I've taken this as an opportunity to present something that's totally new to me and unfinished, in the hopes that it'll generate some discussion and useful feedback, so it's far from polished. Yeah, the focus of the talk is to evaluate a method for estimating the range to a calling right whale using acoustic data recorded on a single hydrophone attached to an ocean glider. So I started images of a Slocum ocean glider, which are underwater autonomous vehicles that swim up and down in the water column for weeks to months at a time, collecting a wide range of oceanographic data. You can just, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but on the sort of, I guess, the stage right side of the screen, you'll see there's a hydrophone strapped onto the nose of this glider. Our group uses these hydrophones to collect passive acoustic monitoring information on several large whale species, including the endangered North Atlantic right whale. For those of you that don't know, passive acoustic monitoring, or PAM, is simply the act of listening for whale sounds and trying to use that information to make some kind of ecological inference. Okay. So Slocum gliders have been in use for passive acoustic monitoring since about 2012, when a group at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution developed a glider-based near real-time acoustic detection system. Since then, there have been about actually more than 50 Slocum glider deployments in the Northwest Atlantic with this sensor package attached, totaling over 2,300 days at sea and over 1,000 near real-time right whale detections. This is a screenshot from whalemap.org that shows the tracks in blue and the definite right whale detections in red. I'm just showing it to highlight sort of the broad coverage of the system and all the work that's been done in the past almost 10 years. Excuse me. While we're looking at the map, I also wanted to draw your attention to this little box south of Boston here with this cluster of red dots. That's where we're going to end up in a few minutes, but have to get through a little bit more background material first. Okay, so PAM, or passive acoustic monitoring from gliders and other platforms, can be very, very useful for making a variety of inferences. Learning more about distribution and movement of these species, doing real-time monitoring or risk mitigation, learning more about the associations between whale distribution and their oceanographic habitats, maybe even doing things like acoustic density estimation. But all of these different applications rely to some extent on a knowledge of the acoustic detection range, or how far the monitoring system can detect whale calls, basically to better define the spatial scale of that detection information we're getting acoustically. So quantifying detection range is challenging and not often done because sound propagation underwater is complicated, especially in shallow water. So shallow water environments here, meaning less than about 200 meters, can be described as waveguides in which low frequency sounds, or those less than about 500 hertz, are trapped between two reflecting surfaces, the ocean surface and the bottom. And here's a kind of idealized schematic showing how sound might transmit in such a waveguide along these zigzag lines from the source to the receiver. And the zigzags are illustrating, how the sound waves might reflect and reflect off the surface in the bottom. So this kind of reverberation causes constructive and deconstructive interference that vary depending on the frequencies of the propagating signal. And for the purposes of this talk, without getting into too much detail, there's a discrete set of frequencies that constructively interfere, and these are called normal modes. Again, for the sake of today's talk, it's sufficient to know that these modes the speed at which these modes propagate changes, and it depends on the number of the mode and the frequency. So higher order modes travel faster than lower order modes, and higher frequencies travel faster than lower frequencies. So this means that as the range from the source increases and these different modes propagate, they spread out or disperse and become visible on a spectrogram as separate discrete arrival signals. And the timing of these different arrivals is related to the environment and the propagation range. So I'm showing here in cartoon form what these modes might look like on a spectrogram. So here is a source signal, frequency on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, just a frequency modulated upsweep. And you propagate that signal for a while, and on the dotted line, this is where the upsweep was, but these three different modal arrivals are what you actually get, actually receive. And that's, again, a result of this, the dispersive quality of normal modes. So the concept of ranging using these modal arrivals is actually pretty simple. First, you have to isolate the modal arrivals. So you have to basically draw the lines through these modes on your spectrogram that I'm showing down here again. And then you need to use a propagation model to simulate modal arrivals from many different candidate source ranges. And then the last step after that is basically to compare the observations with the simulations, and the best match between the two is effectively your most likely range to the source. You can imagine that there's a variety of extensions that allow you to make this much more complicated and incorporate all kinds of different environmental variability and things like that, but sticking with this relatively simple concept. The key here, the step, is the mode filtering, or effectively, again, drawing these lines between these discrete modal arrivals on the spectrogram. So typically mode filtering is done using a spatial filter applied to data collected with a vertical line array. Maybe Najim's going to be talking about that. Just going off his title, I'm not sure. But anyway, this kind of method doesn't apply to single hydrophones. So instead, one alternative is a recently developed method called Timewarping, which is a very cool name to refer to a nonlinear signal processing method that allows you to separate these modal arrivals on a single hydrophone. And I'm not going to get into too much detail here, except to just illustrate the two steps with my cartoon here. So basically, we receive this signal with these clearly separated modal arrivals. Go through one step called phase compensation, where you effectively make this frequency modulated signal appear as an impulse response, or as an impulsive signal, sorry. And then you go through the second step of basically non-linear resampling of that signal to make those modal arrivals appear as horizontal lines on a warped spectrogram. And then as soon as you've done that, you can just very conveniently grab those different modal arrivals, transform them back into the original time frequency domain, and you're off to the races with your ranging. So the goal of this study, with all that background aside, is quite simple. It's to evaluate how well this kind of approach works when applied to ocean glider data. This has been done with single sensor moorings, but never with a mobile platform like a glider. So the approach is pretty simple. It takes advantage of an existing data set. The idea is to apply a time warping method to filter the modal arrivals from glider data for calls that were localized independently using an array, then back propagate those modes to estimate the range to the source and compare the glider and array-based estimates. I'm not going to go into the array localization at all, but I can after if anyone's interested. So here's a map of the study area. Again, we're south of Martha's Vineyard on the east coast of the US. The black line is showing the glider track. And the red triangle here is showing the array that was used to localize the calls independently. Most of this domain is about 30 to 40 meters water depth, with slightly deeper water to the south and a shoal up to the northeast. These blue dots here show the localizations of all the calls that were detected by the glider and localized by the array. And now, for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to focus on a small subset, only about 30 of those calls shown here, basically to just see if this approach is viable at all. So now I'm just going to show the basic steps of the warping method on a single call. Panel 1 shows the spectrogram of the received signal with some obvious evidence of modal dispersion, so mode 1 and mode 2. Panel 2 shows the signal after this phase compensation step, where, again, makes the signal appeal as an impulse. Panel 3 shows after the warping step, which, again, should make the modes appear as horizontal lines, and then the boxes I've drawn around both of them. And then panel 4 shows the original signal with those dispersion curves overlaid, indicating how the modes that were filtered using this technique. I then used a Kraken normal mode model to estimate the modal group speeds, and I was able to parameterize that model using the sound speed profile collected by the glider, which was great. But one limitation of this approach is that you have to assume range-independent sound speed and bathymetry. So you have to assume that the conditions of the glider are the same out to all ranges. Another thing I did here was to invert for both range and bottom sound speed at the same time. And including that bottom sound speed term allows the model to adjust and account for unspecified or unaccounted for variability in the environment. I'm just going to move forward for the sake of time. So here are the results after applying this filtering and ranging method to all the calls. On the x-axis, you have the array-derived range, which refers to the known range between the glider and the whale as determined by the array. And then on the y-axis is the glider-derived range. And you can see, this dotted line is the one-to-one line where all the points would fall if they were in perfect agreement. So you can see that there's a fairly good agreement here, but I prefer to look at the data in terms of the residuals. So here the x-axis is the same, but the y-axis is now showing the glider-based range minus the array-based range. So you know that the scale here has changed. The methods tend to agree within around plus or minus 2 kilometers. But there seems to be this kind of trend in the residuals where the glider is overestimating the range to calls that are close and underestimating the range to calls that are far. So I was curious if this had less to do with range and more to do with changes in bathymetry, as I suspect that assuming the flat bottom could cause problems. So what I did, just to look at that quickly, is the y-axis is the same, but I've changed the x-axis to show the water depth residual, or the difference in meters between the water depth at the whale and the water depth at the glider. So you see, again, a very clear pattern here that shows, I think, two things, mainly that calls coming from depths that are different from the glider produce poor range estimates. And the glider tends to underestimate the range when the whale is calling from relatively deeper water, and overestimate the range when the whale is calling from relatively shallow water. So this suggests that the assumption of range-independent bathymetry is problematic if we want to get really precise range estimates. So in summary, the method seems to perform fairly well within a couple kilometers of a known range, given that these are high-quality calls and the bathymetry is not really varying that much. It's also important to note that the warping technique is reliable, again, but relatively labor-intensive, so it takes quite a bit of time to implement. So for the next steps, I want to try to reduce the manual effort required to do this filtering. I have a few different ideas for how to approach that. But then obviously I'd like to apply this technique to the remainder of the calls in the data set and see when it works and basically when it doesn't work, with the end goal of automating the whole process, integrating it into our call detection software, and then applying it to all glider deployments ever. Lofty goals, but this is a first step. Anyway, that's it for me. I think I'm a little over time, so if you have questions, feel free to email me. But thank you very much, my co-authors and funding sources and lab mates, for your help.
I think we can take 2 questions, or 1 or 2 questions. If anyone has some, just use the raise hand function in the participants window, please. Are there any questions out there? I know there are. So I'll ask a question. What's your plan to tackle the depth dependence? Are you going to use a range dependent model, or are you just going to use a empirical model from the residuals that you have?
Well, I think kind of an empirical model may be the best way to go, because we don't have, at least I can't think of a clever way to get bearing information from the glider. Without bearing information, you don't know, the bathymetry along the propagation path. But there may be clever ways around. I mean, you kind of a brute force method of just like simulating on every azimuth maybe is one approach, but.
Well, that's a very good segue to Najim's talk.
Awesome.
So let's move. let's just seize that opportunity.
Perfect.
So, yeah. Oh, someone's got a question. Taggart's got a question. No. Marlon has a question.
Can you hear? I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, go for it. Shoot.
Yeah, it had to do with the bearing there. I think you kind of answered it there, but so what you get a range, and so what you get is sort of a circle of position, but you can't get a line of position without a bearing. So what options do you have? Well, that looks like you're answering the question right there. So how do you get a bearing out?
Sure.
Of a bearing?
Yeah, there's. I just pulled this up because this is showing really what you get, which is just a radius around. In blue, this is the glider position, and then in red is the known position of the whale. So without switching to a different kind of hydrophone, you don't get any bearing information. But there are possibilities for more sophisticated hydrophone systems that can provide an indication to the bearing. But putting one of those systems onto a glider is a challenge, and probably geared more towards, I don't know who else is on the call, but there might be more appropriate people to answer that.
But as the glider traverses along that axis there, can you get sequential ranges? And I don't know if that would be fine if the whale wasn't moving too.
Yeah, I mean, if these whales were calling really regularly, that would be feasible. I mean, you could get repeat localizations or repeat ranges and localize that way, but their calling rates are really variable, so it's difficult to assume that multiple calls are coming from the same animal or not, or it's hard.
You might want to comment, Hansen, on why this range is so important for the management perspective, because I'm not sure everybody gains why that range is so important.
Well, this was the first year that real-time acoustic detections have been used to trigger fisheries closures in Canada. And so there's huge interest in knowing the uncertainty around those acoustic detections. I don't know if that answers that, Chris.
Well, great. Thanks, Hansen.
Yeah, thank you. And email me with any other questions, people.
Yeah.
Thanks.